September 18, 1998. Napa County, California. At exactly 8:17 on a cool Friday morning, the final appraisal landed on the hood of an aging white Ford F-150 parked beside a neglected hillside vineyard outside the town of Calistoga. The number printed at the bottom of the page was smaller than anyone standing there expected, yet somehow crueler because it looked official. $43,000. That was all the county assessor believed 24 acres of rocky ground, dying vines, and a weather-beaten farmhouse were worth. The banker folded the paper once, smiled without warmth, and told the young widow she would save everyone trouble by selling before winter. Several contractors standing beside him laughed quietly. One even pointed toward the cracked rows climbing the hillside and called them the most expensive weeds in Napa Valley. The woman listened without interrupting. Then she brushed dirt from her jeans, rested one hand on an old tractor beside her, and answered with a calm voice that barely rose above the breeze. "You aren't looking at what this land is today. You're looking right past what it's becoming." Her name was Sarah Whitmore. She was 37 years old, raising 2 children alone after her husband, Daniel, died in a logging accident near Ukiah in March of 1996. She had never imagined running a vineyard by herself. Before Daniel's death, she managed the books while he handled irrigation, pruning, equipment, and harvest schedules. Suddenly, every responsibility became hers. Mortgage payments, payroll, property taxes, broken pumps, sick vines, frost warnings before dawn. She learned because there was nobody else willing to stay. The vineyard itself had a longer memory than either of them. Let me tell you about Whitmore Ridge. Long before expensive tasting rooms and luxury resorts transformed Napa into an international destination, this steep hillside belonged to Sarah's father-in-law, Harold Whitmore. In April 1958, Harold purchased the land for $28,000 from a retired rancher who believed grapes would never grow properly on those volcanic slopes. Everyone preferred the valley floor where tractors moved easily and irrigation cost less. Harold wanted exactly the opposite. He believed rocky hills forced vines to struggle, and struggling vines often produced smaller grapes with deeper flavor. People laughed then, too. Not because Harold was foolish. Because he refused to follow everyone else. Over 4 decades, he terraced the hillsides by hand, stacked volcanic stones into retaining walls, and planted Cabernet Sauvignon where neighboring growers insisted walnuts belonged instead. The harvests were never enormous, but wineries quietly paid premium prices whenever the fruit reached exceptional quality. Harold rarely advertised. He believed reputation traveled farther than signs. When Harold passed away in November 1988, Daniel inherited the vineyard along with something much heavier than land. He inherited responsibility. And sitting inside the old equipment shed was the machine Harold trusted more than any hired crew. A 1956 Ferguson 235 Deluxe. Paint faded nearly to gray. Original Continental Z134 gasoline engine. Roughly 33 horsepower at the drawbar. Barely 3,000 pounds. Purchased brand new from a dealership in Santa Rosa on June 14, 1956, for $1,784 after Harold traded 2 draft horses and paid the remaining balance over 18 months. Most farmers considered it too small by modern standards. Harold called it perfect. Every grease fitting received attention every Saturday afternoon. Engine oil changed every 100 operating hours. Cooling system flushed every spring before cultivation began. By the late 1990s, newer tractors had larger engines, enclosed cabs, hydraulic conveniences, and enough electronics to impress salesmen. The Ferguson had none of those things. It simply started. Almost every time. Sarah often joked that the tractor knew the vineyard better than she did. Sometimes that felt true. After Daniel died, neighbors expected the property to appear at auction within a year. Vineyard work demanded constant decisions, and lenders had little patience with uncertainty. Sarah missed one payment during the winter of 1997 after a late frost destroyed nearly 30% of the developing buds. Another dry summer forced expensive irrigation repairs. Then mildew reduced yields again. By August 1998, overdue bills covered the kitchen table. Yet every sunrise found Sarah outside before 6. Checking moisture. Walking rows. Repairing broken trellis wires. Keeping promises nobody else remembered making. Her children, 12-year-old Emma and 9-year-old Luke, helped whenever school allowed. Emma learned pruning cuts surprisingly fast. Luke loved riding carefully beside his mother on the Ferguson as she cultivated between vine rows. The tractor never hurried. Neither did Sarah. Across the road, however, someone else had very different plans. Michael Grayson was 41, vice president of vineyard acquisitions for Western Crest Development, a company buying aging family vineyards throughout Napa County. Successful. Educated. Immaculately dressed even during field inspections. He understood land values, financing structures, and expansion strategies better than almost anyone in the region. What he did not understand was why Sarah refused every reasonable offer. Western Crest already controlled nearly 600 acres across Napa and Sonoma counties. Sarah's vineyard sat between two of their newest purchases, making her property the missing piece connecting both developments. To Michael, numbers settled arguments. To Sarah, they only described part of the truth. Their first meeting lasted 11 minutes. Their second lasted 9. The third ended before either finished a cup of coffee. Each time Michael increased his offer. Each time Sarah declined politely. No shouting. No insults. Just quiet certainty. Word spread quickly through Calistoga. People began calling Whitmore Ridge the stubborn vineyard. One October afternoon, several growers gathered outside Keller's farm supply while waiting for fertilizer deliveries. Conversations drifted toward harvest yields, labor shortages, and eventually Sarah. Michael happened to arrive at the same time. Someone asked whether he had finally convinced the widow to sell. He laughed. Not loudly. Not cruelly at first. Then another contractor joked that maybe she believed rocks appreciated faster than grapes. The group erupted. One man slapped his knee. Another removed his hat because he was laughing so hard. Michael pointed toward the distant hillside visible beyond the highway. She's trying to farm a vineyard that should have been abandoned 10 years ago, he said. Even Napa can't make miracles out of stone. The laughter echoed across the loading yard. Sarah had just stepped from the Ferguson carrying replacement hydraulic fluid. She heard every word. She looked at the men. Then at Michael. No anger crossed her face. Only patience. She walked closer, set the heavy container gently onto the concrete, wiped her weathered hands with an old shop towel, and met Michael's eyes. My father-in-law used to say vineyards listen longer than people do, she said quietly. If yours has stopped talking, maybe you've stopped paying attention. Nobody answered. The laughter disappeared almost instantly. Michael forced an awkward smile before climbing into his pickup and driving away. The others slowly returned to their conversations, though none sounded as confident as before. That evening Sarah climbed the highest ridge overlooking the vineyard while the setting sun painted every row gold. She crouched near a patch of unusually dark volcanic soil Harold once protected with almost obsessive care. Daniel had protected it too. Neither man ever fully explained why. She reached into the earth, picked up a handful, rubbed it slowly between her fingers. Something caught the fading light. Not quartz. Not ordinary stone. Something else. She stared at it for several long seconds before slipping it carefully into her jacket pocket. The next morning, before sunrise, a black SUV turned onto Whitmore Ridge carrying a visitor who had driven all night from the University of California at Davis, and the first thing he asked Sarah was where she had found that soil sample. The next morning, before sunrise, a black SUV turned onto Whitmore Ridge. The black SUV rolled to a stop beside the weathered equipment shed just as the first streaks of sunlight crept over the eastern ridge. The engine shut off, but the driver remained inside for several seconds, studying the vineyard through the windshield. Every row climbed the hillside with quiet determination, broken here and there by patches of exposed volcanic rock that most growers considered more trouble than they were worth. Finally, the driver's door opened. A tall man in his late 50s stepped out carrying a leather field case instead of a briefcase. His name was Dr. Thomas Ellison, a soil scientist from the University of California, Davis. For nearly 30 years he had studied volcanic vineyard soils throughout Northern California, including several of the most respected Cabernet vineyards in Napa Valley. He walked toward Sarah without wasting time on introductions. "Where did you find the sample?" he asked. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and handed him the small cloth bag containing the dark soil she had collected the evening before. Dr. Ellison opened it carefully. He rubbed the soil between his fingers. Then he smiled. Not because he already knew the answer. Because he recognized the question. "Show me the exact place." Sarah led him up the steep slope while Emma and Luke followed a few steps behind. Even the old Ferguson 235 seemed to watch silently from the edge of the field, its faded gray hood glowing softly beneath the morning light. When they reached the small patch near the upper terrace, Dr. Ellison knelt down without saying a word. He dug only 6 inches. Then 12. Then 18. He stopped. The layers beneath the surface changed dramatically. Dark volcanic ash. Weathered basalt. Fragments of ancient lava mixed with gravel unlike anything found across most of the neighboring vineyards. He looked up at Sarah. "Has anyone ever mapped this property properly?" She shook her head. "My father-in-law couldn't afford it." Dr. Ellison nodded slowly. "I thought so." For nearly 2 hours he collected samples from different elevations, labeling each bag with careful handwriting. Meanwhile, Michael Grayson drove past the vineyard on his way to inspect another property. He noticed the unfamiliar SUV. He noticed strangers walking Sarah's hillside. He noticed measuring rods, survey flags, sample bags. His curiosity lasted only a moment before he convinced himself they were county inspectors preparing another assessment. He smiled to himself. Sooner or later, he believed, reality always caught up with dreamers. 3 days later, Sarah received a phone call. Dr. Ellison asked her to drive to Davis. Immediately. When she arrived, he spread several laboratory reports across a conference table. "I've spent most of my career studying volcanic vineyard sites," he began. "Very few surprise me anymore." He tapped one report. This one did. Sarah remained silent. The upper 12 acres of Whitmore Ridge sit on an ancient volcanic deposit with exceptional drainage and unusually balanced mineral composition. The stress those vines experience isn't hurting them. He looked directly at her. "It's concentrating flavor." Sarah frowned. "But everyone says the vines are struggling." "They are." He smiled. "That's exactly why they matter. Let me tell you about vineyard stress. Many people believe healthy vines should grow fast, produce thick green leaves, and carry enormous clusters of grapes. That sounds logical. It isn't always true. Some of the world's finest wines come from vines forced to work for every drop of water. Rocky soils limit growth. Smaller berries develop thicker skins. Thicker skins often contain greater concentrations of color, tannins, and flavor compounds. A comfortable vine produces quantity. A challenged vine often produces character. Whitmore Ridge had been misunderstood for 40 years. Not because the land was poor. Because it was extraordinary. There was only one problem. Laboratory reports didn't pay overdue loans. Harvest began during the first week of October. Crews moved carefully through the steep rows before sunrise, clipping small clusters into yellow picking bins. The crop looked smaller than neighboring vineyards, exactly as it did every season. Passing drivers shook their heads. Another disappointing harvest. Another struggling year. Sarah ignored them. She remembered Harold's words. Quality traveled farther than quantity. The Ferguson worked from dawn until dusk, hauling half-ton bins toward the crush pad with its familiar steady rhythm. Luke insisted on riding beside his mother whenever she moved another load. "You think Grandpa knew?" he asked quietly. Sarah smiled. "I think he suspected. But why didn't he tell people?" She looked across the hillside. "Because some things are easier to protect when nobody believes they're valuable." 2 days later, Michael Grayson arrived again. This time he carried a revised purchase offer. $480,000. Nearly twice his previous proposal. He considered it generous. Sarah thanked him, then declined again. Michael stared at her. "You've missed payments." "I know. You've had poor yields." "I know. You could give your children security." She folded the papers carefully before handing them back. "They already have it." He laughed softly. "You honestly believe these hills are worth more than this?" Sarah answered with the same calm voice he remembered from Keller's farm supply. "No. His eyebrows lifted. "I believe they're worth enough that one day you'll wish you hadn't stopped at 480. For the first time since meeting her, Michael wasn't certain whether she was stubborn, or simply seeing something he couldn't. Harvest finished on October 18th. Normally Sarah sold her grapes to a small regional winery within days. This year was different. Dr. Ellison had quietly shared his findings with one respected Napa winemaker. That winemaker shared them with another. Then another. Within a week, conversations that had never included Whitmore Ridge suddenly did. Phone calls multiplied. Questions became more specific. Buyers wanted sugar readings, acidity reports, berry weights, block locations. Nobody had ever asked so many questions about Sarah's vineyard before. She answered every one. Without excitement. Without assumptions. Without expecting anything. Late on the afternoon of October 27th, Emma ran from the farmhouse holding the cordless telephone. "Mom." Sarah climbed down from the Ferguson. "It's someone from Napa." She took the phone. A quiet voice introduced himself as purchasing director for one of the valley's oldest family wineries. He wanted to taste fruit directly from Whitmore Ridge before sunrise. The next morning. Personally. Sarah agreed. She hung up. Within 20 minutes, another winery called. Then another. By sunset, for separate appointments filled the following day. Michael Grayson heard the rumors before breakfast. He dismissed them. Small wineries occasionally sampled unusual vineyards. It meant nothing. By noon he wasn't so certain. By evening he drove back to Whitmore Ridge. 4 luxury sedans already lined the dirt driveway. Men and women carrying tasting glasses walked slowly between the vines, speaking in low voices, examining clusters as though they had discovered something hidden in plain sight for decades. Michael stopped his truck. One familiar winery owner passed him without saying a word. Another simply smiled. No one was looking at the land anymore. They were looking at each other. Like competitors. Then Sarah noticed another vehicle climbing the hill. Unlike the others, it wore no winery logo. Only California license plates. When the driver stepped out, every conversation in the vineyard came to an abrupt stop. The driver closed the door without a sound. He was older than most of the buyers already walking Whitmore Ridge. Silver hair. Sun-darkened skin. Boots polished by years of dust rather than leather conditioner. His name was Charles Bennett, founder of Bennett Family Cellars, one of Napa Valley's most respected Cabernet producers. He rarely visited vineyards personally anymore. When he did, people noticed. Every conversation stopped. Even Michael Grayson recognized him immediately. Bennett didn't shake hands first. He walked straight toward the vines. He clipped a single cluster, rolled a berry between his fingers, smelled it, then tasted it. Nobody interrupted. After nearly a minute, he looked toward Sarah. "How old are these vines?" "The oldest blocks were planted in 1962, she answered. "Original rootstock." "Mostly." He nodded. "And you've never irrigated heavily?" "My father-in-law believed vines should earn their water." Bennett smiled. "I think I would have liked your father-in-law." For the next hour he walked every terrace with Sarah while the other buyers followed several yards behind. They discussed slope angles, afternoon sun exposure, volcanic ash layers, pruning methods, and harvest timing. Sarah answered every question honestly. She never exaggerated. She never tried to sell. She simply explained the vineyard she knew better than anyone alive. Michael watched from the edge of the property. Nothing made sense anymore. 3 weeks earlier everyone agreed Whitmore Ridge was nearly worthless. Now some of Napa's most respected buyers were treating it like sacred ground. Late that afternoon Bennett asked one final question. "If someone offered to buy this vineyard today?" Sarah interrupted gently. "It isn't for sale." He looked at her for a long moment. "I wasn't asking because I wanted to buy it." He extended his hand. "I was asking because I wanted to know whether I was speaking to an owner or a steward." Sarah shook his hand. "I'm a steward." Bennett nodded with quiet respect. "I thought so." By evening every winery had left. The vineyard became silent once again. Or so Sarah believed. Just after sunset, another pickup rolled slowly into the driveway. Michael stepped out. He removed his jacket before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Sarah waited. "I laughed at you." "Yes. I thought you were refusing my offers because you didn't understand the market. And now—" he looked across the hillside. "Now I think I never understood the land." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally Michael asked, "Would you tell me what I missed?" Sarah bent down and picked up a handful of loose volcanic stones. "My father-in-law used to carry these in his pockets." Michael frowned. "Why?" "So he'd remember what everyone else wanted to throw away." She handed him one of the dark stones. "Keep it." He slipped it into his pocket without another word. "Let me tell you about patience. People often confuse patience with waiting. They're different things. Waiting is passive. Patience is work. A farmer prunes vines that won't produce fruit for months. Repairs equipment that may not break again for years. Plants trees whose shade he may never enjoy. Real patience isn't doing nothing. It's doing the right thing, long before anyone else understands why. A week later, laboratory testing confirmed what Bennett already suspected. Whitmore Ridge Cabernet possessed remarkable concentration, thick skins, balanced acidity, exceptional phenolic maturity. Numbers alone couldn't describe the wine, but they explained why experienced winemakers suddenly refused to ignore the vineyard. The phone never stopped ringing. 5 wineries became 8. 8 became 12. Then came the offers. Not for the land. For the grapes. The first winery offered $2,900 per ton. Sarah thanked them. Then declined. Another offered $3,400. Then $4,100. News spread through Napa County faster than harvest weather. Whitmore Ridge grapes were becoming the vineyard nobody had noticed until it was almost too late. Michael read every report he could find. He called soil experts, viticulture professors, even retired growers who had known Harold Whitmore. Each conversation ended the same way. "You should have looked at the hillside instead of the balance sheet." For the first time in his professional career, he realized they were right. Have you ever known you were wrong? Not because you lacked intelligence, but because you stopped asking questions. That realization is uncomfortable. Sometimes it's also the beginning of wisdom. On November 6th, representatives from 6 wineries gathered inside Sarah's old machine shed. The Ferguson 235 stood in one corner, freshly washed after harvest. Its faded paint reflected the afternoon sunlight filtering through weathered wooden boards. One buyer glanced toward it. "You still use this?" Sarah smiled. "Every day." Another laughed softly. "I haven't seen one running in years." Luke couldn't help himself. "It starts better than my uncle's new tractor." The room filled with quiet laughter. Even the buyers smiled. Sarah rested one hand on the Ferguson's hood. "My father-in-law bought this in 1956 because he said simple machines leave fewer excuses." Charles Bennett walked over and examined the tractor closely. "The original engine? Never rebuilt. Hours? Just over 11,000. Bennett ran his fingers across the worn steering wheel. "Take care of this tractor." "I plan to." "No." He looked directly at Luke. "I mean for another generation." Luke nodded seriously. "I will." The negotiations began. One winery raised another's offer. Then another. Prices climbed steadily. Nobody wanted to leave without securing at least part of Whitmore Ridge's harvest. Michael stood quietly near the back wall, watching, listening, learning. By sunset, the highest offer reached $6,850 per ton, nearly 3 times what Sarah had ever received before. Still, she hadn't accepted. One buyer finally asked, "What exactly are you waiting for?" Sarah answered honestly, "I'm waiting for someone who values the vineyard, not just this year's grapes." Silence settled over the room. Then Charles Bennett slowly stood. "I have one final proposal." Everyone turned toward him. "I'll match the highest bid." Several buyers nodded. Then Bennett continued, "I'll also sign a 10-year purchasing agreement." The room grew still. "I'll pay premium pricing tied to vineyard quality instead of market averages. I'll finance replacement irrigation where needed. I'll preserve the Whitmore Ridge name on every vineyard-designated bottle. And every label will credit Harold Whitmore for planting these hills when everyone else said he was wasting his life." Nobody spoke. Sarah lowered her eyes. For the first time since Daniel died, she struggled to hold back tears. Then Bennett added one final sentence. "And the Ferguson stays exactly where it belongs." Sarah looked toward the old tractor, then back at Bennett. Outside, headlights suddenly appeared at the end of the long dirt road. Another convoy of vehicles climbed toward Whitmore Ridge. But these weren't winery buyers. They were reporters. And by sunrise, the vineyard that Napa had ignored for 40 years would be on the front page of newspapers across California. By sunrise the next morning, camera crews stood where contractors had once laughed. Reporters walked the same rocky terraces that had been dismissed as worthless only weeks earlier. They photographed the weathered farmhouse, the steep volcanic slopes, and the faded gray Ferguson 235 resting beside the equipment shed. What interested them most, however, was not the machinery or the vineyard. It was Sarah. Every interview began with the same question. "When did you realize your vineyard was valuable?" Her answer never changed. "I didn't." The reporters looked confused. Sarah smiled gently. "I always believed it was." Within days, newspapers across Northern California carried headlines about the forgotten hillside vineyard that had sparked a bidding war among respected Napa wineries. Agricultural magazines requested interviews. Viticulture students visited Whitmore Ridge with notebooks full of questions. Growers who had never spoken to Sarah before suddenly introduced themselves with warm handshakes and sincere respect. Michael Grayson returned one final time before winter. This visit felt different. There were no contracts in his hands. No appraisal forms. No purchase offers. Only a small wooden box. "I brought something," he said. Sarah opened it carefully. Inside lay the dark volcanic stone she had given him weeks earlier. Mounted beneath it was a small brass plate. It read, "Look longer." Michael smiled. "I kept it on my desk until I understood what it meant." Sarah looked at him. "I almost threw it away the first day." "I know. I'm glad I didn't." Neither of them laughed. They didn't need to. Respect had quietly replaced certainty. "Let me tell you about the Ferguson one last time. Machines survive because someone decides they are worth maintaining. Every oil change is a promise. Every grease fitting is a small act of faith. Every careful repair says tomorrow matters just as much as today." That little 1956 Ferguson never won awards. It never appeared in glossy advertisements. But year after year it carried pruning tools, hauled grape bins, pulled trailers, and climbed hills that newer equipment often avoided after heavy rain. It became more than steel and gears. It became proof that usefulness has a longer life than fashion. Spring arrived in March of 1999 with healthy bud break across Whitmore Ridge. The partnership with Bennett Family Cellars transformed the vineyard without changing its character. Broken irrigation lines were replaced. Terraces were reinforced. Weather stations were installed. Yet one rule never changed. Nothing happened without Sarah's approval. Bennett had made that promise. He kept it. The first vineyard-designated Cabernet from Whitmore Ridge was released in the autumn of 2002. Wine critics praised its balance, structure, and remarkable depth. Collectors searched for bottles. Restaurants placed advance orders. The label carried a simple line beneath the vineyard name. Planted by Harold Whitmore, tended by generations who believed before others did. Sarah kept one unopened bottle on the mantel above the fireplace. Not because it became valuable. Because Harold never lived to see people understand his hillside. Have you ever watched someone spend years building something, only to receive recognition after they were gone? It happens more often than we admit. Sometimes the harvest belongs to the next generation. 5 years passed. Emma graduated from the University of California, Davis, with a degree in viticulture and returned home by choice, not obligation. Luke studied agricultural engineering before coming back to modernize the vineyard's equipment without replacing its history. The Ferguson still started every harvest morning. Luke refused every offer from collectors who wanted to buy it. "They're not buying a tractor," he would say. "They're trying to buy my grandfather's fingerprints." 10 years passed. Michael Grayson had changed too. He remained successful in business, but his approach to land became different. Before recommending any purchase, he walked every property himself. He talked with the families. He asked about history before asking about numbers. Young employees often wondered why he carried a small volcanic stone in his pocket during inspections. When they finally asked, he always smiled. "It reminds me that balance sheets can't measure everything." More than once, he quietly advised families not to sell land that others considered unproductive. Some later thanked him. A few never knew why he had changed. He always knew. In the summer of 2014, Bennett family cellars celebrated the 15th vintage sourced from Whitmore Ridge. During the event, Charles Bennett stood before growers, winemakers, and local families. He pointed toward Sarah. "When I first visited this vineyard," he said, "I thought I had come to inspect exceptional grapes." He paused. "I was wrong. I had come to meet exceptional stewardship." The applause lasted much longer than Sarah would have liked. She never enjoyed attention. Afterward, she slipped away to the equipment shed. The Ferguson waited exactly where it always had. She rested one hand on its hood. The metal felt warm from the afternoon sun. For a moment, she could almost hear Harold explaining pruning cuts, Daniel checking tire pressure, Luke laughing as a little boy riding beside her. Some memories never disappear. They simply become quieter. Sarah passed away peacefully in January of 2031 at the age of 70, surrounded by Emma, Luke, and her grandchildren in the same farmhouse where she had once spread overdue bills across the kitchen table. She had lived long enough to watch Whitmore Ridge become one of Napa County's most respected hillside vineyards, not because it grew the most grapes, but because it never abandoned the principles that made it different. Emma and Luke continued farming together. The Ferguson remained in active service for light vineyard work every season. Visitors often asked why they never restored its faded paint. Emma always answered the same way. "Those scratches aren't damage. They're history." Years later, children visiting the vineyard would climb onto the old tractor while Luke explained how their great-grandfather bought it in 1956 for $1,784 and how their grandmother refused to sell either the bought it in 1956 for $1,784 and how their grandmother refused to sell either the machine or the land when everyone told her both were finished. Those children never heard the laughter from Keller's farm supply. They never saw the low appraisal. They never witnessed the bidding war. But they inherited something better. They inherited the lesson. Some things only reveal their true worth to the people willing to believe in them before the world does. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly stood their ground while everyone else doubted them, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or even you. Those are the stories that deserve to be remembered. And if you'd like to hear about the elderly farmer in Sonoma County who rescued a forgotten 1949 Farmel M from a collapsing barn and uncovered a family secret that had been buried for 50 years, I hope you'll join me for that story too. Until then, thank you for spending a little time here on the land where quiet determination always has the final word.